YAHWEH'S Power Days over Egyptian American 400 years. And this title is a summation of the lessons we've covered for the last few weeks since we've been gathering together. And we have seen in the title a summation that there's Egyptian American bondage like oppression as in ancient Egypt. We have seen that in ancient Egypt, there was a 4-generation fulfillment when they came out. But we're seeing here, there's a 400-year prophecy that was spoken to Abraham, in which at the conclusion of it, that judgments would commence on America, which we had seen and immediately proceed since 2019, the 400-year milestone. And we saw the times of the COVID, and now we see the times of world war and the time of the threat of nuclear annihilation. However, we've also seen in this time the awakening of many people to their identity as Israelites, particularly, I would say, in the last year or two since the incident took place with Kyrie Irving, where this young man just tweeted a reference to a book, a video called Hebrews to Negro by Brother Ron Dalton. And that set off a national furor. And many people of our people, even who are still in Christianity, were interested at least to look into what that was about. And whereas at the time, Hollywood was trying to promote Wakanda, a fantasy Black world, then it was superseded and upstaged by people wanting to look at Hebrews to Negroes on Amazon. And you saw how the young man, they did a buck breakdown on the young man. They said stipulations. Now, his situation was different than, like, say, the other young man that played for Memphis, who waves guns, you know, at people and all, and things of that sort. But this young man didn't wave a gun. He just waved a book, some information. And I think the way he got attacked, to me, was harsher than even the young man that was waving a gun to me, in a certain sense, though he didn't get suspended as long as the other young man is. But as you can look at the circumstances of that, I think that was a catalyst that opened up the door where a lot of us began to investigate about, are we the Israelites? And even though this brother did it in a rather sarcastic way, even David Chappelle on Saturday Night Live had to at least mention Hebrews to Negro before a nationwide audience. And see, that right there, I'd never heard any reference to us as identified as such, as Israelites or Hebrews, on any major broadcast like that until then, even though he was doing it in a comedic, sarcastic way, but nonetheless. So with that, then what we're seeing is how to channel that awakening into an awakening that gives us a way of life. You know, when somebody wakes up, I know for me, when you come out of bed, like Elder Yaakov, I'm sure he just got up. He's on West Coast time. First thing you do, you get up, you kind of stumble a little bit, you know, you don't have your balance and trying to find your way in the dark, you know. You may bump a toe here, bump a toe there, and while you're trying to find a way to relieve yourself or something of that sort and type, but you're awake. You're dealing with bad memories, you're dealing with, maybe anxiety about what you got to face in a new day. All of those things come with an awakening. And we have had a lot of that. But what happens when you wake up and you really begin to get stability with your life is when you come to understand what your day-to-day life living is about and what you're going to do that's going to be beneficial and positive for you. So as we're waking up, not only from physical slavery, we're waking up from spiritual slavery. As we already discussed previously, the spiritual slavery that came with the slave revolts during slavery, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and Gabriel Prosser, and the implementation of a monitoring of our worship, because those men were teaching out of the box of the slave masters' religion. And they became, the slave masters decided that they must monitor how we worship, the days that we do it, and the understanding with that who we are, because in their evaluation of us and the times that we worship in like them, you cannot be recognized by anybody as being a Hebrew Israelite or a Jew if you're worshiping on their times. If you're worshiping on first day Sabbath, and yet you say you are a Jew, you're an Israelite, there's no way you have any credibility, because that's a Gentile Sabbath that was established by European Christianity of the Roman Church. And as a distinct, set apart people who are the Israelites, if you're in their system, their days, they have relegated us also to an identity. The identity they have relegated us to, as we do their days, is the curse of Canaan. That's the identity they put on us. All you have to do is look at Pope Leo of 1617, where he said in one of his encyclicals, this was the Pope that sent the encyclical that we should be enslaved to Bartholomew de la Casa, the Portuguese enslaver that brought the first slaves to the New World. This Pope Leo said that this is around 1517, that we were the cursed Canaanites. And this is, so now if I submit to their ways, their days, their spirituality, then I'm walking in the system that has identified me as the cursed Canaanites that were cursed by Noah. Okay, now with that said, if I depart from their system, the Roman system, what they call themselves, Protestant or Catholic, it doesn't matter, or Orthodox, it's still the Roman system. Some of them are a little more Romanized than others. It's still, the foundation is the Roman oppressor system, who today we commemorate Tish B'Av, how they destroyed our nation. And then the sad point is they destroyed our culture, our way of worship. And as a result, they've done, as it was said in Psalm 83, let us cut them off from being a nation. that the name of Israel not be remembered. And so the part of the process of us adapting their culture, their days, is to cause us to forget our days, our culture, and who we are. And so it means to disconnect from that is a point of empowerment for us, where we step up and stand out from their bondage. Now, we do have a scripture, again, a second scripture that follows in line with another one that we did in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, but this is chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, where the Most High says, chapter 16, verse 12, and thou shalt remember that thou wast a slave in Egypt, and thou shalt observe and do these statutes. Now, we remember we read something similar about that in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, verse, I believe it was verse 15, where it says, and remember that thou wast a slave in the land of Egypt, and that Yah, thy Elohim, brought thee out thence through a mighty hand by a stretched out arm. Therefore, Yah, the Elohim, commanded thee to keep the Shabbat day. So Yah is saying he has to bring us out of a slave condition to free us to observe his days. And that means a lot, because he says the same thing here in chapter 16, verse 12 of Deuteronomy, when he's about to introduce other days than just the Shabbat, where he's talking about the feast times. He says, thou shalt remember thou wast a slave in Egypt, and thou shalt observe these statutes, okay? So now he's going to tell us how you are no longer a slave if you observe these days. Yes, Elder Ron, did you have something? Elder Yaakov, you had something? Oh, okay. All right. Anybody have any comment, question at this point? Okay, well, let's look. We already saw he said, I freed you so you can keep the Sabbath. All right. Now we're going to see how he said, I freed you that you may keep these other days. In verse 12 of chapter 16. Verse 13 of chapter 16, he says, thou shalt observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days. Now, notice, we call the Feast of Tabernacles Sukkot. Sukkot means a booth or a makeshift temporary structure. And this was a commemoration that's done in the fall. In fact, this year, we will be down in Mississippi with Elder Yahuda for this feast observance, this one. So if you can make it down there, some of us can, I understand, but if you can make it down there to Mississippi, it's a sign of freedom. But if you can't make it there, just where you are, just remember, this is a feast season that lasts for 7 days. And one of the things we should always look at what Yeshua said. He said, if the Son make you free, you are free indeed. Well, if we look at him, if our freedom is in Yeshua, and it is, he kept all of these days. He kept the Shabbat. He kept the Feast of Tabernacles. All we got to do is look in John chapter 7. And you'll see a reference to him observing the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Sukkot. Look at this, chapter 7 of Yachanan, the book of John. verse 1 and 2. After these things, Yeshua walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. All right. And we jump on down here. It says, verse 10, but when his brethren were gone up, then went he also up to the feast, not open, but it was in secret. So we see that Yeshua observed the Feast of Tabernacles. As his followers, it's clear that both as Israelites and as the followers of the Messiah, if he observed the Feast of Tabernacles, we should follow him to do the same. And this is why, if the Son make you free, you are free indeed. We have freedom now to make a choice to live as an Israelite, as the Messiah Yeshua guides us and leads us. All right, Feast of Tabernacles. Anybody have any comments about that? The Feast of Tabernacles. It will be this year, starting on Friday evening, September the 20, I think it's the 28th. It's the last Friday night of September, and it goes on through to the end of the following Friday, which would be, I think, October the 7th. All right, so I'm gonna jump on now here from chapter 16 to let me read this on to verse 16. Verse 16, Deuteronomy 16:16. 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before Yah the Elohim in the place which he shall choose. And notice here again, just like we saw in Exodus chapter 34 and verses 23 and 24, he calls on the men to appear for these festivals. And it's interesting because it's to the men that he addresses that they must appear before him at that festival time. Now, sometimes that phrase, to appear before him, it can mean a number of things. I mean, they had an actual sanctuary in Jerusalem in that time, where every man in ancient Israel at these special set aside feast days, the annual ones, like tabernacle, they were required to report before the presence of the Most High there. Now, we also know that reporting before the presence of the Most High is when we come together to worship before him, regardless of where we are, and spend time with him. I know that there's instances in scripture where there's people like Elijah who bear witness of his ministry, said, I testify to you of the one before whom I stand before. Now, Elijah hadn't gone to a temple, he was hiding out, but he had spent time in the presence of the Most High. So the Most High is saying, on these festivals, you are to spend time with him. Set aside time for observance of that time with him. And even, there's even more specific detail of that in Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23, which states this in verse 1. and 2. And Yahweh spake unto Moshe, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, concerning the feast of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocation, even these are my feasts. So a holy convocation is a assembly or a holy calling. That Mikra Kadesh is what it says in the Hebrew. Okay, a Mikra is the word that means to be called out, to come together. Mikra means to be called out, to come together. And this is a Mikra Kadesh, which Kodesh means holy. Then this is a call to gather for holy worship. That's what this is. In fact, you can see that each of these feast days are called a Mikra Kodesh. Mikra is the Hebrew word for calling out. There's the capital of Ghana is called Accra, which is a Bantu word that comes from the same word. It means to be called out, because there were a lot of Israelites that went into Ghana. In fact, the original Ghana Empire was started by Israelites that had come out of Israel after the destruction of Jerusalem. So there's still remnants of our words still in Africa where our ancestors sojourned. All right, so Mikra Kadesh. Now, the calling of a Mikra Kodesh, a holy calling to gather for the feast season, is described this way. If you go to Numbers chapter 10. And you'll notice that there's, in chapter 10, a description of Mikra Kodesh in verse 10 of Numbers 10. It says, in the day of your gladness and your solemn days, that's your feast days, and at the beginning of your months, you shall blow with the trumpets. All right, now the trumpets or the shofar, that was the signal that was the calling mechanism to assemble the Israelites. This is why every Israelite gathering, we proceed with the signal blowing of the shofar. Whether we're on Zoom or whether we're in person, it is not a Mikra Kodesh till you have that signal sounded. It's not a solemn assembly until that is sounded. This is why I know it looks dramatic, it's unusual. You don't see people in the churches doing that, but at the same time, that was the signal of a Mikra Kodesh. Notice in chapter 10 of Numbers, verse 1 and 2, and Yah spake unto Moshe, saying, make thee 2 trumpets of silver of a whole piece. Thou make them, that thou mayest use them for the calling, the Mikra of the assembly. All right. So this is why, like when, for instance, we start getting together on Shabbat next week, there's never a meeting where either we got somebody actually blowing a shofar on Zoom, or else we'll play a recording of it at the beginning of that Shabbat service at some point, whether it's recording of a shofar being blown in a song, or sometimes some brothers are better at blowing a shofar than others. I know I'm a horrible shofar blower. I don't have the aperture, but some brothers can take that ram's horn and do wonders with it. So, like I had to get Elder Yahuda to use the shofar for us when we were down in South Carolina. He did a good job blowing it. He blew it so hard that some of the people that have forgotten to come down came down for the observance. He kind of made them feel guilty blowing that shofar that way. So this is what is part of a Mikra Kodesh. Anybody have any questions or comments? All right. Yeah, you're on mute, Craig. Go ahead. You saying something? Go ahead and
But did you have an actual ram's horn?
Yeah, I do have one right here with me.
Oh,
you want to
okay.
see it? You want to see
No,
it?
believe you, brother. I was just,
okay.
So Brother Yehuda blew it, huh?
Yeah, the brother. He did it better than I could
have. That'll be interesting to see.
I know how to blow the shofar. Yeah, I know how to blow the shofar. I do it pretty decent.
Yeah, and so all Israelite gatherings should have, for these solemn feast days, they should have the blowing of the shofar, because he said when your solemn days come, somebody should be blowing it. So some people see us do it and they say, oh, y'all trying to be Jewish. Huh? No, we just being who we are. These commands weren't given to foreign people. These commands were given to Israelites. All right, so this is what comprises coming before the Most High. Every man, getting back to Deuteronomy chapter 16, the men assemble at these set aside times by the signal of the blowing of the shofar. This is why, like on the Shabbat, and we have a record of Josephus, where he testified that every Friday evening, as you're coming into the Sabbath, which begins at evening, that there would be the Kohen, the priest, who would blow the shofar. They'd have those big shofar horns, and they would blow it to signal the time of the Shabbat. This is why, and I've tried to explain to some brothers that this concept some of them are doing, that Shabbat begins on Saturday morning, not Friday evening, is inaccurate with the history of our people. But I don't judge anybody. I mean, that's between them and the Most High, how they're going to do it. Yet I just go by the evidence and the fact that it was from evening to evening. And all of these solemn days start in the evening, all of them, whether it's the Shabbat, whether it's Tabernacles. The first day of Tabernacles is a Shabbat, and the last day of it, the great day, is a Shabbat. And so they all start in the evening, always, not in the morning. And because that's the beginning of a day, according to Genesis 1:2. The evening and the morning was one day. And so we take our authority on how we observe these times by following the example of Yeshua. If we have a record that the priest initiated the Mikra Kodesh Shabbat by the blowing of the shofar on a Friday evening, and the Shabbat was from evening to evening, we see that Yeshua followed that. He never made any statements against that. So I follow him. That's how these feasts become relevant. We see in John chapter 7, he kept Sukkot. He kept all the other feast days. There's reference to him observing the other feast days as well, like Shabbat. All right, now, so when the men would appear, that phrase that they must appear before the Most High, though in that time, it literally meant the temple. But, you know, once you blow that shofar, you are now acknowledging, you're just not assembling with yourself. Now you're coming into an assemblage with the Most High. Now you're coming to be with him, not just with each other, because each male, when that shofar was blown, there were times when they all had to appear at the, what you read in chapter 10 of Numbers, they had to all appear at the door of the tabernacle. All of the men had to appear there. Now, there's no prohibition against sisters coming. I don't see any prohibition against sisters, ahotis coming as well, but the men are required. The women, it was up to them to make that choice. And so verse 16 of Deuteronomy 16 says, 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before Yah, the Elohim. So the way you and I appear now is that we don't have a tabernacle now to go to. We have no temple to go to now. But when we start our feast days with the blowing of the shofar, and we pull together in a group, and people say, well, how many makes it relevant? All I know is it's saying you must appear before him. I know our master said, well, 2 or more gathered in his name, he's in the midst. So he's saying if you're assembling on the feast days around him, you are now appearing before Yah, your Elohim, because Yahshua is Yah Elohim. All right, so the key is to understand a Mikra Kodesh is a holy calling to appear in the presence of the Most High. And this is why if you go to chapter 10 again of Numbers, if you'll notice this in Numbers chapter 10, and if you'll pick up on something here later that the Israelites would do, because to them in verse 33 of Numbers 10, it was the moving of the ark when they journeyed was a representation of Yahweh journeying with them, that his presence would go with them. So here we have is the conclusion of a Mikra Kadesh. The beginning of it is the blowing of the shofar. And the Ark of the Covenant coming at the door of the tabernacle, or coming to the temple where the ark was, the ark represented the throne of Yah, the presence of Yah. So that would be initiated by the blowing of a shofar, of a trumpet. Now, when that presence was recognized by the opening of the meeting, they would say, Kuma Yakwa, Wayafusu Oria Beka Barasaneka Mira Paneka. May Yah arise and his enemies be scattered, and may those that hate him flee as the smoke is driven by the wind. which means we are now in the presence on the solemn assembly, the Mikra Kadesh, the holy convocation. We have come into his presence. And the recitation of the phrase before the Ark of the Covenant was in Hebrew, Kuma Yakwa Wayafusu Beka Mata Saneka Mida Paneka. May Yah arise and his enemies be scattered. And those that hate him flee as the smoke is driven by the wind. Now notice the phrase Kuma or Kumba Ya. Kumbaya. Where you heard Kumbaya from? Who was saying Kumbaya when they were brought into slavery to America? Who was saying that? Our ancestors still was saying that word, that phrase, when they got off the slave ships at Charleston and at Jamestown and at New Orleans and at Mobile. They still knew Kumbaya. Now, let's think about this. I grew up in the South in a Baptist church. Do you ever notice this at the time when you would hear them sing Kumbaya in the church? I remember as a boy. It was always at the beginning of the service. This, usually, you know how it was is you'd have the real devout ones would be there early, sitting up front, you know, the mother's board on one side, the elders, the deacons on the other side. And I would always hear them sing the song, the transliteration of Kumbaya. And then sometimes I would actually hear them saying Kumbaya, but you know, during slavery, the slave masters forbid them to use the phrase Kumbaya because the slave master didn't know what that meant. And you know, the slave master, without realizing, he probably had good reason for doing that, because when they're using the real name of the Most High, Yah, he's in danger for oppressing his people. So the slave master said, y'all can't sing Kumbaya. Y'all have to say, come by here, my Lord. So what you'll hear in the churches, I grew up hearing it in the devotion. There was a dear old sister who taught the nursery school. We used to call her Aunt Katie. And she one of them dear saints. She didn't sing in the choir. She would sit up there on the woman's side, senior women's, the motherboard side. And I never forget, every Sunday morning, she would say, come by here, my Lord. Come by here. And then sometimes she would go, Kumbaya, Kumbaya. Where have we heard that from before? All you got to do is look at your history. Here in Numbers chapter 10, that's what Moses would be saying. That's what the priest would be saying. Why our ancestors still have that understanding? You see, it's because you the people. That's the last vestiges of our language that we still got. It's calling the presence of Yah to come into a Mikra Kodesh holy worship. Now, they were doing it on Sundays. They were on the wrong day. Yet, in the Ruach, they were on the right page. You're supposed to call on the name of Yah. And that's the only song they would sing where it specifically isolates the name Yah. Because when you say Kumbaya, it's three Hebrew words. Kum means arise, Ba means come, and Yah. So that you calling on Yah to come into your midst for Mikra Kodesh. And the thing is, they would sing it before the worship, before the choir comes into the choir stand, before the pastor comes out in his regalia robe and sits in the pulpit and that staff. These people would call on the Most High to show up. Even in our little churches, where you know, they hear me speak Hebrew and say, boy, we can't understand what you're saying. I said, well, you all are singing it, you don't realize it. Well, where you get this Yah or Yahweh? He said, but y'all been saying Kumbaya. You see how the slave master done confused us. He told us to stop saying it that. So our people had to say, come by here, my Lord, to appease him. Yet he couldn't stop it. The name of Yah kept with us.